Sarah Martinez stepped off the bus at Fort Benning, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The Georgia heat hit her face like a wall, and sweat immediately began forming on her forehead. Around her, dozens of other recruits were gathering their belongings, but Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. She was one of only 7 women among nearly 200 men. The drill sergeant's voice boomed across the parking lot, calling everyone to attention. Sarah had dreamed of this moment for years. Ever since watching her older brother Marcus return from his military service with stories of brotherhood, honor, and pushing beyond limits she never knew existed. But now, standing in the scorching sun with her duffel bag weighing down her shoulder, doubt crept in like poison. "Look what we got here," she heard someone whisper behind her. "Bet she doesn't last a week." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. She had heard similar comments during the recruitment process, from family members who questioned her decision, to friends who suggested she choose something more suitable for her 5'4" frame. Her mother had cried when Sarah announced her decision to enlist. "Mija, you could do anything," she had pleaded. "Why choose something so hard?" But Sarah knew exactly why. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she had watched too many of her friends fall into cycles they couldn't escape. She wanted something different, something that would challenge every fiber of her being and prove that determination could overcome any obstacle. The drill sergeant began organizing the recruits into formation, his voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. Sarah found herself in the back row, surrounded by men who towered over her. She could feel their skeptical glances, hear their quiet conversations about whether women belonged in combat training. Each whisper felt like a weight added to an already heavy load. As they marched toward the barracks, Sarah's mind wandered to the letter her grandmother had given her before leaving home. "Remember, mija," Abuela had said, pressing the worn envelope into Sarah's hands. "The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire." Those words echoed in her mind as she took her first steps into what would become the most challenging period of her life. The barracks were sparse and intimidating, with rows of identical beds and footlockers. Sarah was assigned a bunk near the corner, and as she unpacked her belongings, she could feel eyes on her from every direction. The other female recruits seemed just as nervous as she was, but there was an unspoken understanding between them that they would need to work twice as hard to earn the same respect. That first night, lying in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of dozens of people trying to fall asleep, Sarah made a promise to herself. No matter what anyone expected, no matter how many people doubted her abilities, she would not quit. She would push through every challenge, overcome every obstacle, and prove that heart and determination could triumph over physical limitations. The morning would bring their first physical training session, and Sarah knew it would be her first real test. She had trained for months before arriving, running miles through her neighborhood, doing push-ups in her bedroom, and building the mental toughness she knew she would need. But training alone in familiar surroundings was different from performing under the watchful eyes of instructors and fellow recruits who already doubted her capabilities. As sleep finally began to take hold, Sarah whispered a quiet prayer for strength and courage. Tomorrow would begin the journey that would either break her spirit or forge her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The whispers and doubts of others would become the fuel that powered her through the darkest moments ahead, though she didn't know it yet. Outside the barracks, the Georgia night was filled with the sounds of crickets and distant thunder, as if nature itself was preparing for the storm of challenges that would test every recruit's resolve. Sarah closed her eyes, holding tight to her grandmother's words and the burning determination that had brought her this far from home. The alarm bell shattered the pre-dawn silence at 4:30, sending Sarah bolting upright in her bunk. Around her, groans and curses filled the air as dozens of recruits struggled to consciousness. Sarah's feet hit the cold floor running, muscle memory from months of early morning training kicking in before her mind fully awakened. "Move, move, move," Drill Sergeant Thompson's voice thundered through the barracks. "You have exactly 4 minutes to be in formation, and I promise you don't want to be the last one out that door." Sarah grabbed her gear with practiced efficiency, watching as some of the larger male recruits fumbled with their equipment, still shaking off sleep. The first physical training session was a baptism by fire. As the recruits lined up in the dim morning light, Sarah found herself directly in front of Sergeant Williams, a mountain of a man whose reputation for breaking recruits was legendary. His cold gray eyes swept over the formation, lingering on Sarah with unmistakable skepticism. Today we separate the soldiers from the civilians, Williams announced, his voice carrying across the silent ranks. Some of you think you know what hard work means. You're about to learn you were wrong. Sarah felt her heart racing, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give anyone a reason to doubt her readiness. The morning began with a 5-mile run through the Georgia backwoods. Sarah had always been a strong runner, but the pace set by the drill sergeants was punishing. Within the first mile, several recruits had fallen behind, gasping for air and struggling to maintain formation. Sarah stayed near the front of the pack, her breathing controlled despite the burning in her lungs. Look at Martinez. She heard someone gasp behind her. Girl's got wheels. But the encouragement was quickly followed by darker whispers. She won't keep up when the real challenges start, another voice muttered. Sarah channeled every doubt into fuel, pumping her arms harder and finding another gear she didn't know existed. By mile 3, the formation had stretched considerably. Sarah noticed that several of the men who had made comments about her the previous day were now struggling badly, their faces red with exhaustion. She maintained her steady pace, passing 2 more recruits who had slowed to a walk. The obstacle course came next, a brutal series of challenges designed to test every aspect of physical and mental toughness. Sarah watched as recruit after recruit attempted the rope climb, a 30-foot vertical challenge that had already defeated half a dozen people. When her turn came, she could feel every eye on her, waiting for failure. The rope was rough against her palms and her shoulders burned with the effort of pulling her body weight upward. Halfway up, she heard someone below mutter, "No way she makes it." The words hit her like electricity and she found strength she didn't know she possessed. Hand over hand, she climbed until she rang the bell at the top, drawing surprised murmurs from the crowd below. The wall climb proved even more challenging. At 12 feet high with minimal handholds, it required not just strength but technique and determination. Sarah watched the approach of others, studying their movements and planning her strategy. When her moment came, she attacked the wall with focused intensity, using her lower center of gravity to her advantage. Sergeant Williams observed her progress with narrowed eyes. As she hauled herself over the top of the wall, he made a note on his clipboard that would later prove significant. "Interesting," he muttered to another instructor. "The little ones got something the big boys don't." The day's training concluded with weapons familiarization, where Sarah's attention to detail and steady hands earned grudging respect from her peers. She broke down and reassembled her rifle faster than most of the male recruits, her movements precise and confident. That evening in the mess hall, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. While some recruits still harbored doubts, others began to see Sarah differently. She had survived the first major test and her performance had been impossible to ignore. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning, and the real challenges lay ahead. As she wrote her first letter home that night, Sarah reflected on the day's victories and struggles. She had proven she belonged, at least for now, but she could sense that Sergeant Williams was already planning bigger tests. The other female recruits looked to her with a mixture of admiration and pressure, knowing that her success or failure would reflect on all of them. The letter to her grandmother was short but heartfelt. "Abuela, the fire is hotter than I imagined, but I can feel the steel getting stronger. Tomorrow brings new challenges, but I'm ready." As she sealed the envelope, Sarah wondered what trials awaited her in the days ahead, unaware that her greatest test would come sooner than anyone expected. Week 3 of training arrived with a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the intensity building within the recruit company. Sarah had established herself as a consistent performer, neither the strongest nor the fastest, but reliable in ways that surprised even her harshest critics. However, this morning brought an announcement that would test every assumption about her capabilities. "Listen up, maggots," Sergeant Williams bellowed over the rain hammering the barracks roof. "Today we begin combat simulation exercises. You'll be working in teams of 4, and I don't want to hear any complaints about your assignments." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she waited for her team assignment, knowing that some of the male recruits still viewed her as a liability. To her surprise, she was assigned to work with Jackson, Rodriguez, and Chen, 3 of the most capable recruits in the company. Jackson, a former college football player from Texas, had initially been one of her loudest critics but had gradually warmed to her after watching her consistently outperform his expectations. "All right, Martinez," Jackson said quietly as they gathered their gear. Today's the day we find out if you're really one of us." His tone wasn't hostile, but Sarah could hear the underlying challenge. She nodded grimly, understanding that this exercise would either cement her place in the unit or provide ammunition for those who still doubted her. The combat simulation took place in a dense wooded area designed to mimic battlefield conditions. Each team had to navigate a series of challenges while carrying full combat loads, including weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. The exercise was designed to push recruits to their absolute limits, both physically and mentally. Sarah's team started strong, moving through the forest with tactical precision. Her smaller size proved advantageous in the thick underbrush, and her attention to detail helped them avoid several simulated explosive devices that other teams missed. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Then Rodriguez went down. It happened during a river crossing exercise. The makeshift bridge, slick with rain and moss, gave way under Rodriguez's weight, sending him tumbling 15 feet into the rocky creek below. The sound of his ankle snapping echoed through the forest like a gunshot, followed immediately by his agonized scream. "Man down," Jackson shouted. But when they reached Rodriguez, it was clear this wasn't part of the simulation. His ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle and his face was pale with shock and pain. Chen immediately began first aid procedures, but it was obvious that Rodriguez couldn't continue. "We need to get him to the medical station," Chen said urgently. "That's at least 3 miles back through rough terrain." Jackson looked around desperately, realizing that carrying Rodriguez would require at least 2 people, leaving their team severely understaffed for the remaining challenges. Sarah was studying the map when a terrible realization hit her. The medical station was located back at the main camp, but the terrain between their current position and the facility was some of the roughest in the training area. Steep hills, dense forest, and muddy trails made for a treacherous journey under the best conditions. "I'll take him," Sarah announced suddenly. The 3 men stared at her in disbelief. Rodriguez was 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds, almost twice Sarah's weight. The suggestion seemed impossible, even ridiculous. "Martinez, be real," Jackson said. "You can't carry a guy his size that far. We'll have to send for help and wait." But Sarah was already calculating distances and considering options. Every minute they delayed was another minute Rodriguez suffered. And she had read enough about battlefield medicine to know that quick evacuation often meant the difference between minor injury and permanent damage. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I've been running these hills every morning for 3 weeks. I know the terrain better than any of you. Rodriguez needs medical attention now, not in 2 hours when rescue arrives." Chen shook his head. "Sarah, this isn't about knowing the terrain. The weight alone will kill you before you get halfway there." But Sarah was already fashioning a makeshift carrying system using their rope and equipment. She had spent hours studying military rescue techniques, never imagining she would need to use them in training. Rodriguez, despite his pain, tried to protest. "Martinez, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is crazy. I'm not letting a 120-pound girl try to carry me 3 miles through a forest." His words might have been insulting under different circumstances, but Sarah could hear the concern in his voice. With respect, "Rodriguez, you don't get a vote right now," Sarah replied, testing the strength of her improvised carrying system. "Your ankle might be broken, and you could have other injuries we can't see. Every minute we wait increases the risk of permanent damage." The rain was getting heavier, and Sarah knew that weather would make the journey even more challenging. But something deep inside her, a voice that sounded remarkably like her grandmother's, whispered that this moment would define not just her own future, but the perception of every woman who might follow in her footsteps. As she prepared to attempt something that seemed physically impossible, Sarah thought about all the people who had expected her to quit, who had whispered that she didn't belong, who had assumed that her size and gender made her a liability rather than an asset. Today she would either prove them right or show them something they never expected to see. Sarah crouched beside Rodriguez, her hands working quickly to secure the makeshift harness she had created from rope and webbing. The other team members watched in stunned silence as she methodically prepared for what seemed like an impossible task. Rodriguez himself was gritting his teeth against the pain, his face a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "This is insane, Martinez," Jackson muttered, but he was already helping to position Rodriguez for the carry. Despite his doubts, he could. see the determination in Sarah's eyes, a steel resolve that reminded him of his drill sergeant back home. At least let me come with you. Negative, Sarah replied firmly, testing the weight distribution one final time. You and Chen need to complete the exercise and report back. If I don't make it, the instructors need to know what happened and where to find us. Her voice was steady, but inside her heart was hammering against her ribs like a jackhammer. The moment of truth arrived as Sarah positioned herself beneath Rodriguez, feeling his full weight settle onto her shoulders and back. The immediate shock was overwhelming. Nearly 200 pounds of dead weight pressed down on her frame, and for a terrifying moment she thought her knees might buckle before she even took a single step. I can't let you do this, Rodriguez said weakly, pain making his voice strained. Just call for help, Martinez. This proves nothing. But Sarah was already moving, taking her first shaky step into what would become a journey that tested every limit she thought she possessed. The first 100 yards were the worst. Her legs felt like they were made of rubber, and her breathing became labored almost immediately. The rain had turned the forest floor into a treacherous maze of slippery rocks and hidden roots. Every step required complete concentration to avoid a fall that could injure both of them. Rodriguez tried to help by gripping branches and pushing against trees when possible, but his injured ankle made any significant assistance impossible. Instead, he found himself marveling at the determination of the small woman who had taken on an impossible task without hesitation. By the half-mile mark, Sarah's shirt was soaked with sweat and rain, and her legs were beginning to shake with exhaustion. But something remarkable was happening in her mind. The physical pain was transforming into a kind of meditation, each step becoming a small victory against the voices that had told her she didn't belong. The terrain began to slope upward, adding another layer of difficulty to an already brutal challenge. Sarah's pace slowed to a crawl, but she maintained steady forward progress. When she stumbled and nearly fell, Rodriguez expected her to finally admit defeat. Instead, she adjusted her grip, took 3 deep breaths, and continued climbing. "Talk to me, Rodriguez," she gasped between steps. "Keep me distracted." She needed his voice to anchor her to something beyond the screaming protest of her muscles and the burning in her lungs. Rodriguez began telling her about his childhood in San Antonio, his voice providing a steady rhythm that helped Sarah maintain her pace. Halfway through the journey, Sarah encountered her first major crisis. The trail led to a steep ravine that normally would be crossed using a fallen log as a bridge. With Rodriguez on her back, the crossing became exponentially more dangerous. One slip would send both of them tumbling 20 feet into the rocky creek below. "Put me down," Rodriguez insisted. "I'll crawl across if I have to." But Sarah was already studying the log, calculating angles and weight distribution. She had crossed this obstacle dozens of times during morning runs, but never while carrying another human being. The crossing took nearly 10 minutes, each step carefully planned and executed. Sarah's legs trembled with fatigue, and her vision was beginning to blur from exhaustion, but she maintained perfect balance. When they finally reached the other side, Rodriguez was speechless with admiration. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked as Sarah paused to catch her breath. She was bent over, gasping, but still standing under his weight. Her answer came between ragged breaths. "My grandmother used to say that impossible is just a word people use when they're afraid to try." The final mile was pure torment. Sarah's pace had slowed to barely more than a shuffle, and she was stopping every few 100 yards to rest. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire, and her back muscles spasmed with each step. But quitting never entered her mind, even when her vision started to narrow and her hearing became muffled. Rodriguez had stopped talking, using all his energy to hold on and occasionally guide them around obstacles. He could feel Sarah's body trembling with exhaustion, could hear her labored breathing, and found himself praying to a god he hadn't spoken to since childhood. As the medical station finally came into view through the trees, Sarah felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She had done something that everyone, including herself, had believed was impossible. But more than that, she had discovered something about human capability that would change her forever. The last 100 yards felt like a victory lap, despite the agony in every muscle fiber. Sarah could see the surprised faces of medical personnel rushing toward them, could hear shouts of amazement and concern. But all she could think about was her grandmother's letter, still tucked safely in her footlocker, and the words about steel being forged in the hottest fire. As they reached the medical station and gentle hands helped lift Rodriguez from her shoulders, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse to her knees, her mission complete and her place in history secured. The medical station erupted into controlled chaos as Sarah finally released Rodriguez from the improvised harness. Medics swarmed around the injured recruit while Sarah collapsed onto her hands and knees, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Dr. Patterson, the base physician, knelt beside her while his team worked on Rodriguez. "Martinez, can you hear me?" Dr. Patterson asked, checking her pulse and examining her eyes for signs of heat exhaustion or shock. Sarah nodded weakly, though speaking required more energy than she could immediately summon. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her vision was still spotty from the extreme physical exertion. "Get her some water and electrolytes," the doctor called to a nurse, "and someone contact Sergeant Williams immediately. He needs to know about this." Sarah tried to protest that she was fine, but when she attempted to stand, her legs gave out completely, and she found herself sitting heavily on the ground. Rodriguez, now secured on a stretcher with his ankle properly stabilized, reached out to grab Sarah's hand. His eyes were bright with pain medication, but his voice was clear and strong. "Martinez, what you just did, that was impossible. You know that, right? You just carried me 3 miles through rough terrain in the rain. Nobody's going to believe this." Word of Sarah's extraordinary feat spread through the training company like wildfire. Within an hour, recruits who had been completing other exercises began arriving at the medical station, drawn by rumors that seemed too incredible to be true. The story grew with each telling. The small woman from Lossie, Angeles, had carried a 200-pound man through 3 miles of Georgia wilderness. Sergeant Williams arrived at the medical station with a thunderous expression that made everyone fall silent. Sarah struggled to stand at attention, but he waved her back down with an impatient gesture. His gray eyes studied her for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a tone no one had heard before. "Martinez, what possessed you to attempt something so reckless?" he demanded. But there was something in his expression that suggested the question wasn't entirely criticism. Sarah summoned her remaining strength to meet his gaze directly, knowing this moment would define not just her own future, but potentially the opportunities for every woman who might follow. "Sergeant, Rodriguez needed immediate medical attention," she replied, her voice hoarse but steady. "Waiting for rescue would have meant unnecessary risk to his long-term recovery. I assessed the situation and determined I was capable of completing the mission." Her military bearing remained intact despite her exhaustion, and several observers noted the transformation from struggling recruit to confident soldier. Williams walked over to Rodriguez's stretcher and spoke quietly with the medical team. The injured recruit's ankle was badly sprained but not broken, and Dr. Patterson confirmed that the quick evacuation had likely prevented more serious complications. The decision to move him immediately had been medically sound. "The distance from the exercise area to this station is exactly 3.2 miles, Williams announced to the assembled group. "The terrain includes 2 significant elevation changes, multiple water crossings, and areas of dense forest. Rodriguez weighs 196 pounds. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "What Martinez accomplished today defies conventional understanding of human physical limitations." Chen and Jackson arrived breathlessly, having completed their own forced march to reach the medical station. They had finished the combat exercise but abandoned their remaining tasks when they learned about Sarah's successful evacuation. The reunion was emotional, with both men expressing amazement and respect that was genuine and profound. "I've been in the Army for 12 years, Jackson said quietly to anyone who would listen. "I've seen soldiers do incredible things under pressure, but nothing like this. Martinez just redefined what's possible." His earlier skepticism had been completely replaced by admiration that bordered on awe. The story reached the ears of other drill sergeants, medical personnel, and even base command within hours. Phone calls were made, reports were filed, and by evening Sarah found herself the subject of an informal investigation to verify the details of her accomplishment. Military protocol required documentation of any event that challenged established training parameters. Dr. Patterson's medical report would later become part of military training literature. He noted that Sarah's successful evacuation demonstrated exceptional physical conditioning, tactical thinking, and mental toughness that exceeded standard expectations. Her ability to maintain focus and determination under extreme physical stress marked her as an exceptional candidate for advanced military specialties. That evening, as Sarah finally had a chance to shower and change clothes, she found a message waiting for her. Her grandmother had somehow learned about the day's events and had called the base to leave a brief message. "Mija, today you proved that the strongest steel comes from the hottest fire. I am proud of you." The physical toll of the evacuation would require several days of recovery, but the psychological impact was immediate and lasting. Sarah had not only proven her capabilities to her critics, but had discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known existed. The young woman who had stepped off the bus weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true limitations existed only in the mind. As she wrote in her journal that night, Sarah reflected on the day that had changed everything. "Today I learned that impossible is just another word for untested," she wrote. "The only question now is what other impossibilities are waiting to become realities." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Sarah Martinez was no longer the same person who had arrived at Fort Benning with dreams of proving herself worthy of wearing the uniform. The news of Sarah's extraordinary rescue spread far beyond Fort Benning's gates. Within a week, military journalists arrived to document the story, and Base Command found itself fielding calls from news outlets across the country. The young recruit who had once worried about proving herself worthy was now the subject of intense scrutiny and unexpected fame. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, summoned Sarah to his office on a humid Thursday morning. She entered with careful military bearing, though internally she felt overwhelmed by the attention her actions had generated. The colonel's office was lined with commendations and photographs spanning a 30-year career, each image telling a story of military excellence and achievement. "At ease, Martinez," Colonel Harrison said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. His weathered face carried the kind of authority that came from decades of leadership, but his expression was thoughtful rather than stern. "I've been in the Army for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like what you accomplished last week." Sarah remained silent, unsure whether the attention was positive or problematic. Military life had taught her that standing out could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on the circumstances. The colonel continued, his voice carrying genuine curiosity about her background and motivation. "Tell me about your training before you arrived here," he said. "The physical conditioning required for what you did doesn't develop overnight." Sarah explained her months of preparation. The early morning runs through East Los Angeles, the bodyweight exercises in her cramped apartment, and her grandmother's unwavering support for her military ambitions. The conversation revealed something unexpected. Colonel Harrison had grown up in a military family where physical limitations were seen as challenges to overcome rather than permanent barriers. His own daughter was currently serving as a combat medic in Afghanistan, breaking her own barriers in military service. "Martinez, your actions have attracted attention from some very high places," the colonel explained, opening a folder filled with communications from Pentagon officials and military training specialists. "There are people who want to study what you did, to understand how it might change our approach to physical fitness standards and emergency response protocols." The implications were staggering. Sarah's instinctive decision to carry Rodriguez had accidentally challenged decades of assumptions about physical capabilities and gender roles in military service. Research teams wanted to analyze her technique, physiologists wanted to study her conditioning, and policymakers were questioning established limitations. However, the attention wasn't entirely positive. Some critics argued that Sarah's achievement was a dangerous anomaly that could encourage reckless behavior among other recruits. They worried that unrealistic expectations might be placed on soldiers who lacked her specific combination of determination and conditioning. Sarah found herself caught between competing pressures. Fellow female recruits looked to her as proof that anything was possible, while some male recruits struggled with the implications of being outperformed in such a dramatic fashion. The training environment became charged with new tensions and expectations that hadn't existed before. Sergeant Williams, who had become an unlikely ally, offered perspective during one of their regular training sessions. "Martinez, greatness always makes people uncomfortable," he said while watching her complete another flawless rope climb. Some people will try to diminish what you did because it challenges their understanding of what's possible. The psychological pressure began affecting Sarah's performance in unexpected ways. Every training exercise now carried the weight of expectation, with observers noting whether she could maintain the standard she had set. The natural confidence that had driven her to attempt the rescue began wavering under constant scrutiny. Rodriguez, now recovered and back in training, became one of her strongest supporters. His perspective on the rescue provided crucial context for investigators and reporters. "People ask if I was scared," he told one journalist. "Of course I was scared, but watching Martinez push through impossible, physical barriers to get me help, showed me something about human potential that I'd never seen before." The training company's dynamics shifted permanently after the rescue. Competition among recruits intensified, but it was now tempered by a deeper understanding of teamwork and mutual support. Sarah's example had demonstrated that true strength often meant putting others' needs before personal comfort or recognition. Military psychologists studying the incident identified several factors that contributed to Sarah's success. Exceptional preparation, mental toughness developed through childhood challenges, and a support system that had taught her to view obstacles as temporary rather than permanent. Her grandmother's influence, in particular, had created a mindset that refused to accept conventional limitations. As the attention gradually subsided, Sarah found herself changed by the experience in ways she was still discovering. The young woman who had worried about proving herself worthy had become someone who understood that worthiness wasn't something to be proven to others, but something to be demonstrated through actions when others needed help. The rescue had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would influence military training protocols, inspire countless other women pursuing military careers, and fundamentally alter Sarah's understanding of her own capabilities. She had arrived at Fort Benning hoping to become a soldier. She had inadvertently become something far more significant. Graduation day at Fort Benning arrived with clear skies and temperatures that seemed perfect for celebration. Sarah stood in formation with her fellow recruits, her dress uniform crisp and her boots polished to mirror brightness. The young woman who had stepped off a bus months earlier, filled with doubt and determination, had been transformed into a confident soldier ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The ceremony itself was standard military protocol, but the atmosphere carried special significance because of the events that had transpired during training. Families filled the bleachers, and Sarah's heart swelled when she spotted her grandmother in the front row, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride. Beside her sat Rodriguez's parents, who had insisted on attending to personally thank the young woman who had saved their son from further injury. Colonel Harrison delivered the keynote address, speaking about courage, dedication, and the importance of never underestimating human potential. While he didn't mention specific individuals by name, his words clearly referenced the extraordinary rescue that had captured national attention and changed perspectives about military service. "You have learned that true strength isn't measured in pounds lifted or miles run," the colonel said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "True strength is found in the willingness to push beyond what you thought possible when others are counting on you. You have learned that the word impossible is often just another word for untested." When Sarah's name was called to receive her completion certificate, the applause was thunderous and sustained. Her fellow recruits, who had once questioned whether she belonged among them, now cheered with genuine respect and admiration. The sound washed over her like a wave, validation of a journey that had tested every aspect of her character. Sergeant Williams approached her after the official ceremony, his expression serious but respectful. In his hand was an envelope bearing official military letterhead. "Martinez, you've been selected for advanced training in emergency medical response," he announced. "Your actions during the rescue demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking and determination we need in our medical specialists." The opportunity was everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Advanced medical training would open doors to specialized military occupations and provide skills that would serve her throughout her career. More importantly, it represented recognition that her unique combination of physical capability and mental toughness had practical value beyond symbolic inspiration. Rodriguez approached as Sarah was saying goodbye to her instructors. His ankle had healed completely, and he moved with the confidence of someone who had also been transformed by their shared experience. Martinez, I want you to know something, he said quietly. What you did for me wasn't just about carrying someone to safety. You proved that caring about others can give us strength we didn't know we possessed. The reunion with her grandmother was emotional and profound. Abuela held Sarah's hands and studied her face, recognizing the changes that months of military training had created. Mia, you look different, she said softly. You look like someone who has discovered who she really is. Sarah's response surprised even herself. Abuela, I learned that the person you always said I could become was inside me all along. I just needed the right circumstances to let her out. The wisdom in those words reflected a maturity that had been earned through challenge and growth rather than simply acquired through the media attention gradually faded, but the impact of Sarah's actions continued to resonate throughout the military community. Training protocols were modified to include more emphasis on emergency response and team support. Female recruitment saw a significant increase as young women across the country were inspired by the story of someone who had proved that determination could overcome physical limitations. 3 months after graduation, Sarah received a letter that brought her journey full circle. A teenage girl from Phoenix had written to thank her for showing that military service was possible for women who didn't fit traditional expectations. I used to think I was too small to be a soldier, the letter read. Now I know that being small just means I have to be twice as tough. And you proved that's absolutely possible. Sarah's response to the young woman became part of her regular correspondence with aspiring female service members. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do, she wrote. Instead, show them what you can accomplish when you refuse to accept limitations that exist only in their minds. Years later, when Sarah had become a decorated medical specialist, serving in multiple deployments, she would often reflect on the day she carried Rodriguez through 3 miles of Georgia wilderness. That moment had taught her something crucial about human potential and the power of refusing to quit when others were counting on her. The rescue had lasted only a few hours, but its lessons would guide her through a distinguished military career that included saving lives in combat zones, training new generations of soldiers, and eventually becoming the kind of leader who inspired others to push beyond their perceived limitations. Sarah Martinez had arrived at Fort Benning, hoping to prove she belonged in the military. Instead, she had discovered that belonging wasn't something to be earned through others' approval, but something to be claimed through actions that demonstrated character, courage, and an absolute refusal to give up when the stakes were highest. In proving herself worthy of wearing the uniform, she had accidentally proven something far more important, that the word impossible was just another challenge waiting to be overcome.